A medical breakthrough in the heart of Pittsburgh offers hope to millions around the world. Let's explore the pivotal moment together. On February 23, 1954, the first polio vaccines are administered. Polio is a highly contagious disease that seemed impossible to stop. It attacks nerve cells and sometimes the central nervous system, causing muscle deterioration, paralysis, and even death. Children are especially susceptible. In 1938, President Franklin Roosevelt, whose legs had been paralyzed by polio, founds the March of Dimes. 10 years later, the nonprofit enlists Dr. Jonas Salk from the University of Pittsburgh to combat the disease. Salk's research shows 3 basic types of polio and 125 different strains. He determines that an effective vaccine needs to combat all 3 types. Salk develops the vaccine by growing samples of poliovirus and then deactivating them by adding a chemical called formalin. The patient is therefore immunized without becoming infected. A group of children from Arsenal Elementary in Pittsburgh receives the first injections. By 1955, 4 million shots have been given. By 2001, worldwide polio cases have been reduced by 99%. Stay tuned, because coming up, we'll learn more about FDR and his battle with polio. We'll also learn more about the impact of the vaccine. We'll learn a bit about polio's history and about polio today. And don't forget to check out Today in History in my Teachers Pay Teachers store. There's a link in the description. Okay, so the virus that causes the disease, the virus itself is known as poliovirus, and the disease is known as poliomyelitis. It's believed to be of ancient origin, and there is some evidence that would indicate that the disease was in ancient Egypt as early as about 1500 BC. But the major polio epidemics begin in the latter half of the 19th century. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was, of course, the most famous polio victim, but he's different than most polio victims because he was not a child when he contracted polio. He was 39 years old, and the disease permanently paralyzes his legs. He considers for a bit leaving politics, but decides to make it a go. And he wins his very first term as president 11 years later in 1932. Now, he hides his disability from the public, and it was a very different time, of course. And it's crazy to think that the majority of Americans had no idea that the President of the United States could not walk. So how was he able to hide this, and why? Well, the big why is because in those days, which I think it would be very different today, but in those days there was a real stigma attached to physical disabilities. And there was the fear that if people knew about his physical disability, that he wouldn't be able to get votes, that people would somehow attribute that to making him unfit to lead as president, which of course is definitely not the case. He's one of our very greatest presidents, and one that's honored with a monument in Washington, D.C. Now, how did he get by? Well, he had braces that he would wear, and he would wear them under his pants when he was giving certain public speeches, and that enabled him to stand up straight and even kind of walk a few steps if he needed to, because of these heavy braces that he wore on his legs. He also had a specially made wheelchair, and it was made out of a regular chair, so that when he was sitting at his desk, what you'd see of the back of the chair looked like a normal everyday chair, when in fact it was a wheelchair. He even had his car rigged up so that he could drive his car using only his hands. So a pretty cool contraption for the time. Polio was at its most dangerous when it paralyzed breathing muscles. And this was a typical thing for many people who contracted polio. And really the only way to treat this, and the only way to keep people alive in this circumstance, was to put them in what's known as an iron lung. And this is a tube, an airtight tube, where just the head was on the outside of the tube. And inside the tube, the air pressure would change, and that would induce inhalation and exhalation. Now, for the most part, if you ended up in an iron lung, which many did, you were only there for about 1 to 2 weeks, because the paralysis with polio oftentimes was temporary. And so once your breathing, once those muscles had regained their function and this paralysis had gone away, you were able to to come out of that iron lung. But sadly, there were many who lived the rest of their lives inside of an iron lung. Now, Salk's initial vaccine was very effective by vaccine standards. It was about 60 to 70% effective at preventing the disease. But in 1962, another version was created by Albert Sabin, and this one was created very differently. It was done by creating a weakened form of the virus. This particular vaccine was swallowed rather than injected, and it became more popular because it was cheaper to manufacture and it was a lot easier to administer. So this became the predominant vaccine, not just in the United States, but around the world. Now, one of the scary things I guess you could say about polio is that there's no cure once it's contracted. But polio has essentially been eliminated from the United States, and it is extremely rare in the rest of the world. Let's look at some stats related to it. So in 1952, that's just 2 years before the vaccine that we just learned about was first administered, there were 58,000 cases in the United States in 1952. 5 years later, so 3 years after the vaccine in 1957, that had dropped to all the way down to 5,400 cases, so by 90%. In 1962, that number drops to 910 cases. In 1967, it's down to 41 cases in the United States. And in 1979, it was declared eliminated from the United States. Now, there still have been here and there a case, but the last case in the United States, reported case, was way back in 1993. That is until 2022, when there was one single case reported in Rockland County, New York. All right, well, if you've liked what you've seen, please like and subscribe. And remember, there's another great Mr. Lewis video right here. And you know what? You can click right here and get even another Mr. Lewis video. Thanks again for watching.